In this podcast episode, David Mendoza shares his personal experiences with the United States, Spain, and the United Nations regarding a legal case he was involved in. He discusses his involvement in the marijuana industry, his escape from the U.S., and his experiences in Spanish prison. He also criticizes the actions of the U.S. government and highlights the lack of accountability in cases of extradition and kidnapping. Mendoza also discusses his civil lawsuit against the Obama administration and his efforts to challenge the seizure of his property by the U.S. government. He concludes by discussing the broader implications of these cases and the erosion of the U.S.'s influence in international affairs. Mendoza begins by recounting a story of a German man who owed him his life and was tragically shot in Vancouver. He criticizes the corrupt system that allows prosecutors and police agents to escape charges for their involvement in illegal activities. He then discusses his own case and the challenges he faced when he was extradited from the United States to Spain. He explains the concept of treaty transfer and how it allows for the transfer of a prisoner's sentence to their home country. However, he highlights the resistance he faced from various U.S. agencies, including the CIA, FBI, and State Department, who initially opposed his treaty transfer. Mendoza reveals an attempt by the Spanish government to exchange him for 5 Colombian prisoners, but he refuses to sign the document, fearing for his family's safety. He emphasizes the collaboration between governments to protect their own interests, often at the expense of individuals like himself. He then delves into the legal aspects of his case, highlighting the violation of his human rights and the unjust sentencing he received in Spain. He explains his plans to sue the United States for damages but was prevented by a new law passed by the European Union. Instead, he pursued a case against the Spanish government for failing to protect his human rights. Mendoza shares the emotional toll his imprisonment took on him and his family, particularly his 2 young sons. He reflects on the injustice faced by many individuals, especially African Americans, who receive harsh sentences for nonviolent offenses. He criticizes the prison industry and the hypocrisy of politicians who prioritize their careers over the lives of those affected by their decisions. Mendoza discusses the broader implications of these cases and the erosion of the U.S.'s influence in international affairs. He mentions the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and the subsequent arrests of Canadian citizens in China as a response. He argues that the actions of the U.S. and its allies create an outlaw environment and undermine their credibility. He also mentions his involvement in advising the Russian and French governments on extradition cases and highlights the recent denial of Julian Assange's extradition to the U.S. by the British courts. Mendoza goes on to share his experiences with the CIA and KGB and their global kidnapping operations. He explains his own case and how he was promised certain guarantees by the American government, but they were not fulfilled. He highlights the importance of having a deed of surrender to ensure that promises are kept. Mendoza also discusses other cases he has been involved in, including Canadians extradited to the United States and the case of an arms dealer extradited from Spain. He emphasizes the issue of diplomatic notes and how they can be manipulated by different parties involved in an extradition case. He gives examples of cases where individuals were promised the right to serve their sentences in Canada but were not sent back, as well as cases where individuals were given long sentences despite assurances from the American government. The conversation then turns to the case of John McAfee, who was arrested in Spain for extradition to the United States on tax evasion charges. Mendoza describes McAfee as a commanding and distrustful individual who was arrested for speaking out against the U.S. government. Mendoza was contacted by McAfee's wife for help, but before he could assist, McAfee was found dead in his prison cell. Mendoza expresses his belief that foul play may have been involved in McAfee's death and criticizes the lack of transparency in the investigation. Mendoza also discusses his own experiences with intimidation by U.S. authorities. He believes that his efforts to expose the truth and fight against injustice have made him a target for surveillance and intimidation. In conclusion, this podcast episode provides an in-depth look into David Mendoza's personal experiences with the U.S., Spain, and the United Nations regarding his legal case. He shares details about his involvement in the marijuana industry, his escape from the U.S., and his experiences in Spanish prison. He also discusses his frustrations with the U.S. government's actions and his ongoing legal battles. The episode sheds light on the dark side of international law enforcement and the devastating impact it can have on individuals and their families. It raises important questions about the abuse of power by governments and the need for accountability and justice in the face of corruption and injustice.